Well, this missing submersible is all over the news right now. It was on an expedition to visit the Titanic at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. The sub went missing on Sunday, just a few days ago, with 5 people on board. The partnership, which is up on the surface waiting for them, hasn't heard from them since Sunday. It only has 96 hours of oxygen, and rescue efforts are underway to locate it. Having an adventure go sideways like this is exactly what I talk about here on my channel. The cost of seeking adventure can be really high. But like any adventure, this comes up over and over again. Is the risk ever worth it? So let's talk about the submersible, the company behind it, who was on it, what could have happened, and the challenging rescue efforts. So the submersible is called Titan, and it went missing, like I said, on Sunday, June 18th off the coast of Newfoundland. It's a 6.5 meter or 21 foot long vessel that was launched as part of an expedition involving the Polar Prince, an icebreaker that was hired by a company called OceanGate. The ship ferried dozens of people and the submersible craft to the wreck site, where Titan was scheduled to make multiple dives. And now, to get on this excursion, it is costly. It goes beyond what regular people can afford. Tickets can cost a staggering $250,000. But it's more than just a ticket, according to the company anyways. These people who pay are contributing to the advancement of ocean exploration, and they're more like they're funding the trip and future trips than just being a regular passenger. The company calls these people mission specialists. And CEO Stockton Rush says that these specialists are trained on communications and other things on the submersible, so they're really more crew members than just regular old people. The Titan is capable of diving to 4,000 meters or 13,000 feet with a comfortable safety margin, says the company. It takes a craft about 2.5 hours to descend to almost 4,000 meters or 12,500 feet, where the Titanic lies in a trench. It weighs around 10,000 kilograms or 23,000 pounds, and it communicates with its partnership up on the surface using sonar signals. If it's positioned right, it can also send text messages as well, but they're really slow to go through, but it is another way of communicating. So after the sub started descending, all communication with the ship stopped about an hour and 45 minutes later. The last ping was directly above the Titanic. They figured they were at about 2,700 meters or 9,000 feet when they lost communication with the sub. And now the craft does have propellers, and it's controlled by the pilot and this is one of the things that the internet went wild about, is it's controlled by a video game controller, a very basic game controller.
We run the sub with this game controller. It's made by Logitech, but it's basically a Sony PlayStation style controller.
Now, while it sounds totally crazy, there's people out there that say this basic technology is actually good because it's so simple. There's not a lot of things that can go wrong with it, and that other organizations use this type of controller for more complex things. And the partnership will guide the sub to the Titanic wreck using sonar and text messages, because they plop it down and it may end up in different spots on different dives, depending on ocean currents and all that stuff. So they have to tell it where to go. And sometimes it can't even find the wreck. It'll be down there for hours and it can't find it because it's pitch black. You can't see a thing. They do have lights on the sub, but it's still very difficult to find. So OceanGate is the company behind this, and they're based out of Washington State. And they're not rookies in this. They've successfully completed over 14 expeditions and over 200 dives in the Pacific, Atlantic, and the Gulf of Mexico. Titan had undergone more than 50 test dives, included to the equivalent depth of the Titanic, but I couldn't find exactly how many times it had been down to that depth. Following every mission, they say that they evaluate and update the procedures as part of a continued commitment to evolve and ensure operational safety, and that there's an unparalleled safety feature that assesses the integrity of the hull throughout every dive. And malfunctions do happen. If you see some of the interviews with people who have done the trip, they say that it happens pretty regularly. But it's also not super surprising because it's such a new technology, there's going to be some trial and error. It's like when people started to fly, they didn't just jump on a jumbo jet right away. They had to trial and error their way through it, and there was certainly some injuries and deaths along the way. It's just one of those risks of advancing technology. So who's on board? Stockton Rush, as I mentioned earlier, he's the founder and CEO of OceanGate. He trained as a pilot and became the youngest jet transport rated pilot in the world when he was 19. And he flew for Overseas National Airway during his college summers, and then he founded OceanGate in 2009, a nonprofit organization which aims to catalyze emerging marine technology to further discoveries in marine science, history, and archaeology. OceanGate owns and operates 3 5-person submersibles for deep-sea exploration. In an interview, he spoke about visiting the Titanic and said, "What really strikes you is how beautiful it is. You don't normally see that on a shipwreck. It's an amazingly beautiful wreck." Paul-Henri Nargeolet was also on the sub, and he's sometimes referred to as Mr. Titanic. He's a 77-year-old French explorer who's the director of underwater research at the Experiential Media Group. They own the salvage rights to the Titanic. He's a former commander in the French Navy and served for 25 years. He was also a deep diver and a minesweeper. So after he retired from the Navy, he led the first recovery expedition to the Titanic in 1987 and is a leading authority on the wreck site. He's led several expeditions to the Titanic, completed 35 dives in a submersible, and supervised the recovery of over 5,000 artifacts. In a 2020 interview, he spoke of the dangers of deep diving and saying that, "I'm not afraid to die. I think it'll happen one day." A longtime friend said that he had good leadership and he's the kind of man who will keep them calm. Hamish Harding is also on the sub, and he's a 58-year-old British billionaire and chairman of the aviation company called Action Aviation. He's based in the United Arab Emirates and describes himself as a world explorer. He holds a few Guinness World Records, one for the fastest circumnavigation of Earth by aircraft, and another for the longest time spent at full ocean depth during a dive to the deepest part of the Mariana Trench, which is the deepest part of the ocean, which is pretty incredible. And Hamish has also been to space. He posted on social media that he was proud to be heading to the Titanic as one of those mission specialists. He said, "Due to the worst winter in Newfoundland in 40 years, this mission is likely to be the first and only manned mission to the Titanic in 2023. Friends say he'll be an important asset to others in the Titan right now, that he'd go through emergency checklists and procedures along with the captain, and he'd just be a good person to have on board." But he had an appetite for exploration and said that, "My view is that these are all calculated risks and are well understood before we start." Shahzada Dawood and his son Suleiman are also on the craft. Shahzada is 48 and a vice chairman of one of Pakistan's largest conglomerates. They have investments in fertilizers, vehicle manufacturing, energy, and digital technology. He has a wife and 2 children, one of which is 19-year-old Suleiman, who is on the trip with him. His family has said that he's always been interested in exploring different natural habitats. And Suleiman is apparently in university. His family said that he's a big fan of science fiction literature and learning new things. He also has an interest in Rubik's Cubes and playing volleyball. So what could have happened? Experts and former passengers say that there's a few things that could have gone wrong. One is that the sub is run on batteries, and there could have been some kind of blackout that rendered the sub incapable of controlling where it goes, and maybe knocked out the communications. Another thing is that they could have had a crash in the software that made all the systems non-functional, so again, no contact. There could have also been a fire on board that may have malfunctioned the systems or created toxic fumes that incapacitated the crew. There could have also been a flood or some kind of leak that happened, which resulted in an implosion of the sub. And then another thing is the sub could have gotten tangled in the Titanic wreckage or loose nets that are floating around the ocean called ghost nets. And the Titan actually has 7 different mechanisms to rise to the surface. If one fails, another one will kick in. And there's even a mechanism that will work if the crew's gone unconscious. After 16 hours, this is supposed to kick in and make the sub resurface on its own. But the other problem is if they get to the surface, rescuers have to find this tiny white minivan-sized craft in a massive ocean amongst whitecaps. And another issue is that the craft is bolted from the outside. So when they got in, the crew behind them bolted in all those bolts, and there's no way for them to get out on their own if they were at the surface. So US and Canadian planes have been involved in the rescue, but the remote location and depth make it super challenging. If the crew is still in the Titan, they might have oxygen for a little bit longer, but the other risk is hypothermia. Down at those depths, the ocean is just above freezing, and they don't have a lot of clothing on them. They just have their overalls that they went out in, and they have some food and water rations, but not a lot, because they were only supposed to be down there for like 8 to 10 hours. And then there was a press conference today, and the biggest news that came out today, actually last night, was banging that was heard. Apparently one of the airplanes had heard some banging on regular intervals that caught their attention. The rumors were that it was at regular intervals and the banging went on for about 3 minutes and then it would stop and then it would continue on the half hour. And people say this is likely Paul Henry because he was in the Navy. He knew that making those kind of noises at regular intervals would stand out to rescuers. But the Coast Guard in their press conference today did not confirm that regular interval banging, but they did say that there were noises.
Human sounds, nature sounds, and it's very difficult to discern what the source of those noises are at times, but I can tell you that this team has multiple sensors. They're in the area. They're sending data back expeditiously to the best in the world.
And they said as of today, June 21st, midday on the East Coast, that they were still 100% still on a search and rescue mission. But one of the big problems is that the distance to the site from St. John's, where they're all coming from, is 900 miles. So that makes getting the equipment there really challenging and time-consuming. Currently, there's 5 assets searching, and there will be a total of 10 in the next 24 to 48 hours, so there's more coming. And there's also, right now, there's 2 remotely operated vehicles, or ROVs, searching. And several more are en route and are going to be there tomorrow. There's also 2 back-to-back P3 flights. One is ongoing, which provides a total of 14 hours of continuous on-scene coverage. There's also 2 C-130 flights as well that fly all day and into the evening. They also said that equipment that has the capability to send cables down to those depths and beyond, actually, are being loaded onto the ships in St. John's right now, and they were expected to make their way out to the site later today. They may even be on their way there now. I also read that a French ship with a tethered submersible is on its way, and this submersible is remote controlled and has a camera and spotlights and a robotic arm on it. So if it's able to find it, it can also possibly untangle it and then attach whatever cables they need to haul it up to the surface. And there's been a lot of interesting discussion on the good and the bad of this whole expedition. Former passengers are really unique because they've been down there with this company and they have a lot to say about it. So David Pogue is one of them, and he's a CBS correspondent, and he was on the ship last year. But during the expedition he was on, the sub was lost for about 5 hours. The ship still had communication with the sub, but they didn't know where it was. It just kind of disappeared off their radar. In the end, it ended up showing back up again and made it to the surface okay, and everyone was fine.
I'll admit that the night before the dive, I did not sleep at all. I was exhausted. I was petrified. Once I was actually in the sub, and it's under the command of Stockton Rush. He's the CEO and the designer of the sub, and he's, by the way, the one driving. He's the pilot of the missing sub as well. And he told me that they've done 20, 25 of these dives over the last 3 years. Successfully, no injuries, no harm, no deaths. I felt better, and I was very excited to do the dive.
And then there's Ron Toigo from British Columbia.
My first trip, we had a similar scenario where we kind of got stuck at the bottom for some time, and you still felt pretty safe, though. Spend your first number of days there really going over everything that could go wrong and how you're supposed to respond and being prepared for whatever happens, and you're really set up for 5 or 6 days if you had to stay at the bottom until they have to come and get you with a Navy sub or something. I never felt unsafe at any time, and I know the people at Ocean Gate, safety is paramount about everything. But things can happen, and I think they're prepared to manage it and deal with it.
But if you've heard former Royal Navy Commander Chris Perry talk about it, you'll know that he has a much different take on this whole thing.
It is actually a PlayStation controller, and I looked around. There's a lot of laptops and things like that in there. I mean, it's a typical garden shed arrangement, and I wouldn't go in it. I'm afraid it looks an absolute death trap.
He said there's 2 options if it's on the bottom of the ocean. You could grab it with another submersible, or you could attach a hook to it and drag it to the surface with a crane. And he said he would have either another submersible or a hook, like in a crane, nearby all the time, just in case something like this happened. And while it is possible to bring it back to the surface, they still have to find it, and that's like finding a needle in a haystack. There's no distress signal, so finding it is going to be really difficult. And then he brought up the issue of regulating things like this, like Who's regulating it? No one. There was no regulatory body that approved this craft at all. And he thinks there'll be massive regulation changes coming after this. And late last night, there was a tweet that he put out that said he'd been contacted by a reliable informant who said that he warned about the Titan submersible having structural issues a mere 5 weeks ago. And there's a ton more information out there, and it's coming out at rapid speed. I can't even keep up with all of it. So if you've heard other stuff, comment down below and I'll cover it in the next video. I'll put out another video tomorrow going over all of this. There's also some information on a court procedure in 2018 that accused OceanGate of not taking safety seriously. So all those documents are coming out. And there's other people who have sued Stockton for fraud. So there's just a ton of information coming out. But let's also chat about the risk and what is too great of a risk for an adventure. Where do you draw the line? I've told stories about all levels of risk, from somebody who just went out for a Sunday bike ride who almost died after crashing, to someone who made really questionable decisions while paddling the Amazon River solo. And speaking about risk, there was a guy who was on the Titan twice. He went down to see the Titanic, and this is what he said about risk. If we were unable to accept risk as a society, we'd still be paddling canoes down rivers. We'd never learn to sail across oceans. We would have never gone into outer space. It's just risky. Anyways, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and let's all hope that they find that sub soon and everyone makes it out okay.